Right, let's jump straight into this explainer and completely deconstruct the incredible cultural machine that was the Italian Renaissance. Now, since you've already written the reading, you definitely know the big names, you know the famous paintings, and you've seen the gorgeous architecture. But today, we're not just going to memorize facts or list off a bunch of biographies. Instead, we're going to look under the hood.
To truly wrap our heads around this era, we need to ask ourselves a central, guiding question. Why did the Renaissance develop so strongly in Italy specifically? And what actually made Renaissance culture so different from everything that came before it? Basically, what were the specific conditions that fueled this massive intellectual and artistic explosion? Let's figure it out.
Section 1. A wealthy, fragmented Italy. To understand the mindset of the Renaissance, we first have to understand the geography.
When we look at the political landscape of the 15th and 16th centuries, the very first thing to realize is that Italy was absolutely not a unified country. It was this fiercely competitive, complex patchwork of independent city-states, places like Florence, Venice, Milan, Siena, Padua, and Genoa. Because Italy commanded the Mediterranean basin and somehow managed to avoid the stifling, full-blown feudalism that took over the rest of Europe, these urban centers became highly independent. You had Milan serving as a crucial gateway to Northern Europe, while massive maritime republics reached way out to the east.
And here is where it gets really interesting. This intense political and social disunity actually fostered a hyper-competitive environment. You had massive, overarching rivalries, like the popes battling the emperors, which literally split cities down the middle into factions called Guelphs and Ghibellines. But this wasn't just some high-level political theory, it was intense street-level identity. People would literally wear different colors or stick feathers on a specific side of their cap, just to boldly show their allegiance. If you asked a Renaissance Italian where they were from, my fatherland meant their specific city. It was deep local patriotism. And that fragmentation meant every single city was constantly trying to outshine its neighbors, politically, economically, and culturally. That fierce competition was fueled by enormous wealth, particularly in those maritime republics we mentioned. Take Venice and Genoa, for example. Venice had a maritime arsenal employing 16,000 men, boasting thousands of vessels that traded impartially with literally anyone. Christians, Muslims, it simply didn't matter to them. Trade was trade. Meanwhile, Genoese businessmen were incredibly innovative, becoming early adopters of double-entry bookkeeping and pushing their trade routes all the way from the Black Sea straight out to the Atlantic. And these merchants weren't just bringing back spices and silk, right? They were bringing back alien ideas, totally diverse cultures, and a secular, practical sharpening of the mind.
Section 2. Florence's economic engine. Now, if Venice and Genoa were the undisputed maritime kings, Florence was the city that figured out how to turn commercial wealth into cultural capital.
Think about the number 91,500. That was the population of Florence around 1343. To put that in perspective, for the time period, this was a massive, buzzing metropolis. It was an absolute powerhouse of production, built around a complex proto-capitalist system, where a full third of the city's residents were employed just in the textile industry alone.
Florence was highly structured around trade guilds. You had the Arti Maggiori, the 7 greater guilds of the super-wealthy bankers and major manufacturers, and then the Arti Minori, the 14 minor trades covering everyday commerce. This rigid structure created a uniquely powerful business class. The people running Florence valued keen minds, incredible organizational efficiency, and mathematical precision. They were practical, they were wealthy, and they were deeply invested in the civic life of their city.
To manage all of that booming industry, Florence essentially transformed itself into the financial capital of Europe. We're talking about 80 major banking houses. They were cashing checks, issuing letters of credit, pioneering marine insurance, and setting fixed exchange rates. They had so much capital on hand that they were literally financing the international wars of English kings. This economic engine is what generated the immense surplus of wealth necessary to actually fund a cultural revolution. Because let's be real, you need a whole lot of surplus wealth before you can afford to pay a Michelangelo to carve a block of marble.
Section 3. The power of patronage. Because having mountains of wealth is one thing, but you need individuals who are actually willing to spend it.
And that brings us to the concept of the patron, perfectly embodied by Cosimo de' Medici. He understood a crucial reality early on. Patronage was absolutely not just simple generosity. Taking his family's massive banking fortune and investing it back into the city was a brilliant strategic move. Funding art, architecture, and scholarship directly communicated family prestige, civic pride, and serious political influence. Now, the Medici definitely didn't single-handedly invent the Renaissance, but they absolutely mastered the art of using wealth to purposefully shape a society.
Just look at the sheer scale of their cultural investments. Cosimo brought the Council of Florence to his city, which meant a flood of brilliant Greek scholars suddenly walking the streets. He supported game-changing artists and architects. He literally employed 45 copyists at the same time for the sole purpose of transcribing ancient texts that simply couldn't be bought. And then, he took these incredible collections, like the library at San Marco, and just opened the doors to teachers and students for free. Wealthy families, guilds, and the church were all pouring this commercial money straight into education and art.
Section 4, the Humanist Revolution. All that funding and intense civic pride is what sparked the movement we call humanism.
Now, let's clear up a massive misunderstanding right now. Humanism did not mean rejecting Christianity. Not at all. It was the study of the Studio Humanitatis, things like grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. It was this huge, renewed fascination with the human experience itself. Humanists deeply believed that if they could recover ancient Greek and Roman texts, study them carefully, they could actually use that ancient wisdom to educate people and solve the very real problems of their present day.
This pursuit became an absolute all-consuming obsession. Thinkers like Petrarch and Poggio Bracciolini acted like literary explorers. Poggio literally hunted through the neglected, rotting corners and dark dungeons of monasteries all across Europe just to rescue forgotten classical manuscripts. There's this amazing description of Poggio finding a lost text by the ancient author Quintilian in a foul dungeon. He imagined the ancient writer was actually stretching out his hands from the parchment, begging to be saved from his barbarian jailers. That is how intensely they felt about this knowledge. This gradual return of Greek thought leads us to a crucial correction of a very popular historical myth. You will often hear people claim that the Renaissance suddenly kicked off because Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, which supposedly caused Greek scholars to suddenly flee to Italy in a panic.
But honestly, that narrative is fundamentally backwards. The fall of Constantinople played only a minor role in sparking the movement. Italian interest in the classics was already absolutely thriving decades earlier. Scholars like Manuel Chrysoloras were already teaching Greek in Italy by 1397. By the time Constantinople actually collapsed in 1453, Italy was already fully primed, incredibly wealthy, and totally obsessed with antiquity. The escaping scholars strengthened the movement, sure, but they definitely didn't create it from thin air.
Section 5. Classical meets Christian. Finally, let's explore how this newfound obsession with the classical world seamlessly blended with the existing one.
Because remember, the Renaissance did not just magically erase the religious Middle Ages. It was a profound intellectual blend. The church remained the ultimate patron of the arts, and traditional religious subjects were still the absolute primary focus of most works. But the approach completely changed. Humanists started treating ancient pagan figures like Socrates and Plato almost like uncanonized saints, elevating them right alongside the traditional church fathers. The Renaissance expanded the European worldview by beautifully marrying classical antiquity with Christian devotion, rather than replacing it.
And you can see this synthesis play out directly, right before your eyes, in the art. It was a gradual transformation toward naturalism. You had early artists like Giotto suddenly making figures more physically solid, more human, and deeply emotional. Then you have brilliant minds like Brunelleschi literally studying ancient Roman ruins to figure out the engineering required to build the massive dome of the Florence Cathedral, all while helping pioneer mathematical linear perspective to create convincing 3D space. These artists weren't just mindlessly copying antiquity. They were using ancient geometry and the affirmation of the healthy human body to solve entirely new problems. They were literally using classical Apollos as models for Saint Sebastian and Italian Aphrodites to represent the Virgin Mary.
So, bringing all these threads together, the Renaissance was absolutely not a sudden explosion of genius out of nowhere, and it wasn't the work of one single family or one dramatic historical event. It was a gradual, highly structured transformation. It was an engine. Geography and trade created massive wealth in fragmented, hyper-competitive city-states. That exact competition drove a practical, wealthy business class to use patronage to show off their civic pride. That specific money funded the humanist recovery of classical knowledge, which artists and thinkers then brilliantly synthesized with their existing Christian worldview.
Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to ponder. If the cultural rebirth of the Renaissance was driven by this very specific, powerful engine of new commercial wealth, intense local competition, and a passionate rediscovery of the past, what are the overlooked engines driving the cultural and intellectual shifts of our own era today?
And how might we, just like those humanists, use the forgotten knowledge of the past to solve the incredibly complex problems of our future? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the machinery behind the Renaissance.